From the outside, my life looked like something people envied. A solid house in the suburbs paid off, a wife who still smiled at me across the dinner table after 28 years. Two grown kids, one a lawyer, the other a teacher, both doing well, both still calling on Sundays. I had the kind of job that didn't make me rich but let me retire at 60 without worry. The neighbors saw a man who had it all figured out. But here's the thing about a life that looks perfect. It's the small, quiet moments that tell the real story. Every morning I woke at 6:15 without an alarm. The bed was always half empty by then. Carol had been an early riser for years, long before I retired. I'd hear the coffee machine humming downstairs, the soft clink of her spoon against the mug. By the time I made it to the kitchen, she'd be dressed, her hair neatly styled, her smile polite. "Morning, Tom." Not cold, not warm, just there. We had our routines. Breakfast in silence, the local news murmuring in the background. She'd ask about my plans for the day, golf, maybe, or helping Frank next door with his deck. I'd ask about hers, book club, lunch with Diane. The answers never changed. I told myself this was just what long marriages became: comfortable, predictable, safe. But sometimes, when I was alone in the garage, organizing tools I hadn't used in months, I'd catch myself staring at the wall, wondering when exactly we'd stop talking about anything real. When the last time was that she'd really looked at me the way she used to when we were young and stupid, and certain love was enough to keep the world out. The kids noticed, I think. Our daughter, Sarah, would sometimes pause during her calls, her voice careful. "You guys doing okay?" I'd laugh it off. "Of course. Why wouldn't we be?" But I saw the way she and her brother exchanged glances during visits, how the house felt too quiet, even with all of us in it. Then, one evening in October, Carol didn't come down for dinner. I found her sitting on the edge of our bed, still in her coat, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice, just said very softly, "I can't do this anymore." And just like that, the life everyone thought was perfect, the life I thought was enough, was over. I didn't fight it. Maybe because part of me had known for years. Maybe because, in that moment, I realized I couldn't remember the last time either of us had been happy. She left the next morning. No scene, no lingering goodbye. Just the sound of her car pulling out of the driveway, the same way it had every day for years. Except this time, she wasn't coming back. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched coffee. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel it, the weight of all the things we'd never said. The first few weeks after Carol left, I operated on autopilot. I made coffee for one. I mowed the lawn because the grass kept growing, indifferent to my personal catastrophe. I even showed up to my usual Wednesday golf game, where the guys clapped me on the back and said all the right things. "You'll bounce back. Plenty of fish in the sea. Hell, at least you got the house." I nodded like I believed them. But the truth was, I didn't know how to exist in a world where I wasn't half of something anymore. Then, one rainy afternoon, I found myself standing in front of her closet. I hadn't planned on going in there. But the door was slightly ajar, and something about the way her empty hangers lined up like ribs in a skeleton made me stop. Most of her clothes were gone. She'd taken what she needed when she left, but a few forgotten things remained. A faded Michigan sweatshirt from our first vacation together, a pair of scuffed gardening shoes, a single pearl earring tangled in the corner of a drawer. I picked it up, rolling it between my fingers. It was from a set I'd given her on our 20th anniversary. "A pair for every year," the jeweler had said. I remembered how she'd gasped when she opened the box, how she'd kissed me and whispered, "You still know how to surprise me." But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped surprising her, stopped trying. And now here I was, holding half of what used to be whole. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the earring digging into my palm. The house was so quiet. No hum of the TV in the other room, no distant clatter of her arranging flowers in a vase. Just the sound of the rain and my own breathing. That's when I noticed it. A small, leather-bound book tucked behind her nightstand. I knew what it was before I even opened it. Her journal. She'd kept one for as long as I'd known her, scribbling in it before bed most nights. I'd never read them, never even considered it. But now, with the weight of that pearl in my hand, I hesitated. What if the answers were in there? What if I finally understood when things had started to unravel? I reached for it, then stopped. Because the real question wasn't when it had fallen apart. It was why I hadn't noticed. I put the journal back. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the earring still on my nightstand. I thought about all the moments I'd dismissed, the way she'd sometimes pause mid-sentence, as if deciding whether whatever she was about to say was worth the effort. The way she'd started sleeping on her side of the bed like it was a territory, not a shared space. The way she'd looked at me that last morning, not with anger, but with something worse. Resignation. I'd spent decades believing love was something you built once and then just maintained. But maybe it was more like a garden. Neglect it long enough, and even the strongest roots wither. The earring glinted in the dim light. I closed my eyes and wondered if it was too late to start watering. 3 months to the day after Carol left, I saw her again. I'd started going to the grocery store on Thursday afternoons, not because I needed anything, but because the rhythm of it gave structure to my empty weeks. That particular Thursday, the store was crowded with people rushing home before the storm hit. I stood in the cereal aisle, staring blankly at the boxes, when I felt it. That strange electric awareness of being watched. And there she was. Carol stood 15 feet away, holding a basket with a single loaf of bread and a carton of almond milk, the same brand she'd always bought. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, styled in a way I didn't recognize. She wore a blue sweater I'd never seen before. For a suspended moment, we just stared at each other across the aisle. Two strangers who knew every secret the other had ever carried. Then she smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile from our last year together, but something softer, more real. My chest ached with the familiarity of it. "Tom," she said. Just my name, but it sounded different now. Lighter, like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying for years. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. What do you say to the person who used to know you better than anyone? The one who'd seen you at your best and worst and everything in between? The one who'd finally walked away when you stopped being worth the trouble? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A child whined for candy somewhere nearby. The moment stretched, thin and fragile. Then she tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when she was deciding something. "It's good to see you," she said finally. Not, "I miss you." Not, "I'm sorry." Just that simple, devastating truth. She was glad to see me even now. I nodded, my throat tight. "You too." We stood there another beat, the air between us charged with all the things we weren't saying. Then she adjusted her grip on the basket. "I should—" She gestured vaguely toward the checkout. "Yeah, of course." She hesitated once more, her eyes searching mine for something. Then she walked past me close enough that I caught the faint scent of her shampoo, still the same, after all this time. I didn't turn to watch her go. I stood there, staring at the cereal boxes, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading away. The bread in my hand was crushed from how tightly I'd been holding it. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey, tracing the water ring it left on the wood. The house was quiet, but now the silence felt different. Before, it had been absence. Now, it was possibility. Because here's the thing that kept me awake long after the whiskey was gone. When she looked at me today, for the first time in years, it felt like she was actually seeing me. And I wasn't sure what scared me more, that she might look away again, or that she might not. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment in the grocery aisle. For days I replayed it in my mind, the way Carol's eyes had softened when she said my name, how her fingers had tightened around the basket handle when she hesitated. It was the most alive she'd seemed in years, maybe the most alive I'd felt in years too. On Tuesday morning, I found myself driving past her new apartment complex. I told myself I was just taking the scenic route to the hardware store, but when I saw her sitting on the balcony with a book, my hands clenched the steering wheel. She was wearing those old reading glasses, the ones with the slight dent in the left temple from when I'd accidentally sat on them years ago. Some part of me had assumed she'd replace everything, erase all traces of our life together. But there they were. I parked down the block before I realized what I was doing. Through the rearview mirror, I watched her turn a page, tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. All those familiar gestures that used to be part of my daily landscape. A man about my age walked out onto the balcony and handed her a coffee. She smiled up at him in a way that made my stomach drop. Then she laughed. That sound carried all the way to my car. I hadn't heard her laugh like that, really laugh, and I couldn't remember how long. Not the polite chuckle she'd developed for social events, but the deep, unguarded laughter that used to make her snort if something was really funny. The kind I'd somehow stopped earning years ago. The man squeezed her shoulder before going back inside. She watched him go with an expression I recognized. That quiet contentment I'd seen early in our marriage when we'd still looked at each other like we'd won some private lottery. I drove home with my chest aching. Not with jealousy, but with something worse. Understanding. That night, I pulled out our old photo albums for the first time since she'd left. There we were at Niagara Falls, her clinging to my arm as the mist soaked through our jackets. At Sarah's college graduation, my arm around Carol's waist as we beamed with pride. Then the later years, the photos growing fewer, the smiles more careful, the distance between our bodies just slightly too wide. The last picture was from our 28th anniversary dinner. We sat across from each other at some fancy restaurant, glasses raised. On the surface, it looked perfect. But now I could see what I'd missed at the time, how her smile didn't reach her eyes, how my shoulders were angled slightly away, how the space between us could have fit another whole person. I closed the album and ran my hand over the worn leather cover. The truth was, there all along, hiding in plain sight. We hadn't lost each other suddenly. We'd been letting go for years, 1 millimeter at a time, until one day there was nothing left to hold on to. The clock ticked in the silent living room. Outside, a car door slammed, followed by laughter as neighbors greeted each other. I sat there wondering if it was too late to learn how to hold on, and whether she'd even want me to try. The rain tapped against my kitchen window like a persistent stranger as I stared at my phone, thumb hovering over Carol's name in my contacts. 2 weeks had passed since I'd seen her with that man. 2 weeks of sleepless nights spent replaying every mistake, every missed opportunity. The photo album still sat on my coffee table, gathering dust, but refusing to let me forget. Then the text came. Found some of your old tools in storage. Thought you might want them. Simple, practical. Nothing that betrayed emotion. But it was the first time she'd reached out since leaving. My pulse quickened as I studied the message, reading meaning into every word. Was this just about tools? Or was it an olive branch? I responded carefully. Thanks. When's good for you? Her reply took 12 excruciating minutes. Tomorrow at 4? I'll leave them on the porch if you'd prefer. The option was there, to take the coward's way out, to avoid seeing her again. But something in me rebelled against that idea. I'll come by, I typed. Be good to catch up. The following day passed in a haze. I changed shirts 3 times, finally settling on the blue one she'd always said brought out my eyes. The drive to her apartment felt both familiar and foreign, like retracing steps from a dream. When she opened the door, she looked different than at the grocery store. Softer somehow, wearing that old Michigan sweatshirt I'd found in her closet months before. Her hair was down, slightly damp at the ends like she'd just showered. For a moment, we just stood there, the space between us charged with all the things we weren't saying. The tools are in the garage, she finally said, stepping aside to let me in. Her apartment smelled like lavender and something baking. Banana bread, I realized. She'd remembered it was my favorite. The living room was neat but lived in, photos of the kids on the mantle alongside new ones I didn't recognize. My eyes caught on a framed picture of her and the man from the balcony standing arm in arm at what looked like a vineyard. Paul took that one, she said quietly, following my gaze. We went to Napa last month. Paul. So that was his name. I nodded, my throat tight. Looks nice. We stood there in the quiet kitchen, the banana bread cooling on the counter between us. She hadn't made it for me, I realized. She'd made it because she still liked it too. That small, mundane truth hit me harder than any dramatic revelation could have. We were still connected in these tiny, ordinary ways, even after everything. As I gathered the tools from her garage, my old hammer with the chipped handle, the wrench set I'd gotten for my 40th birthday, I noticed she'd organized them exactly how I always had. Some habits, it seemed, were harder to break than others. "Thanks for these," I said at the door, the weight of the toolbox in my hand nothing compared to the weight in my chest. She nodded, her fingers playing with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "Tom," she started, then stopped. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we couldn't say. In that moment, I realized with startling clarity that I still loved her. Not the idea of her, not the memory of what we'd been, but the woman standing before me now, flawed and human, and trying to be happy. The question wasn't whether I wanted her back. The question was whether either of us could risk trying again. "Take care, Carol," I said finally, stepping into the evening light. As I walked to my car, I didn't look back, but I felt her watching me go, just as I had watched her all those months ago. The difference was this time neither of us had let go yet. The toolbox sat unopened in my garage for a week. Every time I passed it, I'd run my fingers along the dusty lid, but couldn't bring myself to lift it. It wasn't the tools I was avoiding, it was the ghost of her hands that had packed them, the care she'd taken to remember which ones mattered. On Saturday morning, I found myself at our old diner, sliding into the cracked vinyl booth we'd shared every Sunday for 20 years. The waitress, Marge, who'd served us since the kids were in diapers, brought my coffee without asking. "She's not coming, is she?" she said softly, nodding at the empty space across from me. I shook my head, staring at the faint ring stains on the formica where Carol's teacup used to sit. That's when I noticed it. A small heart carved into the table's edge, nearly worn away by time. Our initials inside. I'd forgotten about that summer afternoon when we'd laughed like teenagers, stealing kisses over pancakes while I scratched our promise into the cheap wood. My fingers traced the weathered grooves as Marge refilled my cup. "You two were something special," she murmured before moving on. The truth settled over me like snowfall. Quiet, inevitable. I'd spent months mourning the end without ever fighting for a new beginning. The man she'd seen with, Paul, he made her laugh. But had I even tried to in those last years? Or had I just assumed our love was bulletproof, something that would endure without tending? I left a 20 on the table and drove straight to her apartment, my hands trembling on the wheel. But as I turned onto her street, I saw them together on the balcony, her leaning into his shoulder, his arm around her waist. They looked peaceful. Pulling over, I watched through the rain-streaked windshield as Carol threw her head back in laughter at something he said. That unguarded joy I remembered from our early years. It was still in her, just not for me anymore. I restarted the car as their lights flicked on against the gathering dark. The decision wasn't whether to fight for her. It was whether I loved her enough to let her be happy, even if that happiness wasn't with me. The engine idled at the stop sign. Right turn would take me home. Left would take me... where? I gripped the wheel as the wipers beat time against my hesitation. For the first time in 30 years, I had no idea which way to go. I drove to Carol's apartment one last time. Not to fight for her, not to beg. Just to see her face when I told the truth I'd been too afraid to admit, even to myself. The autumn air smelled of wood smoke as I stood at her door, my breath shallow. When she opened it, her eyes widened, not with anger, but something closer to recognition, as if she'd been expecting me. Behind her, the apartment was dim, no sign of Paul, just the faint glow of a single lamp and the hum of the radio playing that old folk song we danced to in our kitchen years ago. "I came to apologize," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Not for the little things, For the years I stopped trying, for assuming you'd always be there. She didn't speak, just stepped aside to let me in. The air between us was heavy with all the words we'd swallowed. I sat on her couch, hands clasped, while she perched on the armchair across from me, close enough to touch, but miles away. Then, quietly, she said, "I stopped trying too." The confession hung in the air. No blame, just the simple, aching truth. We'd both let it wither. She looked down at her hands, twisting the wedding band she still wore on her right hand. "Paul and I, it's not what you think. He's my cousin. He's been helping me through—" Her voice broke. "Through the cancer scare." The world tilted. All those assumptions, all that jealousy. It collapsed like a house of cards. The laughter I'd seen, the comfort. It wasn't romance. It was family. It was fear. I reached for her hand, and she let me take it. Her skin was warm, familiar. "Why didn't you tell me?" She met my eyes, tears glistening. "Because I needed to know if you'd fight for me without a reason, if you'd choose me just once without being forced to." The silence stretched between us, filled with 30 years of love and loss and everything in between. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, sending a shower of golden leaves past the window. I squeezed her hand. "What now?" She didn't answer right away. But for the first time in years, she didn't let go. Maybe that was enough.